Hello everyone, welcome to eLearnChat, where you always learn something new. I'm Rick Zanotti, and I'm joined today by my good friend and co-host, coming to us from the other side of the pond. She's coming to us from just outside London. She is Leslie Price, and she's with learnappeal.org.uk. It's a charity. Check them out. They really do some good stuff. And running the video switcher, mixer, and show production, we've got Harold Muliati in-house. Our guest today is Perry Timms. He'll be joining us in a moment. Here we go. This show is sponsored by Relay Corporation. Digital learning development, media development, corporate video, management consulting, and more. Visit us at www.relate.com. Thanks. And joining us in that center position of power, it is Perry Timms, an HR expert, learning, all sorts of things. Perry, nice to meet you here.
Nice to meet you too. It's great that you could invite me in, and great to share some of the things that I've got a lot of passion for.
Yeah, and you have a new book that just came out.
I do. I've got one here. Yay! There we go. Fantastic. Yeah, the Energized Workplace. Yeah, it was a title that came from a TEDx talk I gave in April 2018,
nice.
Where I talked about the essence of work design having very little to do with people's energy and all about like competence and workflow. Yet actually energy is probably the most precious resource we have. And when I looked into it, I found some staggering figures, like in the UK alone. 595,000 days of work are lost through workplace stress because people are under too much pressure and their energy is completely depleted. And I thought that was wrong.
Yeah, it is interesting how much stress affects everybody. It's, and one of the things we do in our office, did we lose anybody?
No.
Okay. I didn't hear anybody. One thing we do in our offices, which also helps with stress, is we change our lighting out. We did some research years ago. There was an eye doctor, OTT, who came out with the OTT light, and it's a full spectrum light. So we started changing all the office lights to full spectrum. People have much less headaches, much more energy when they go home, because fluorescents tend to drain our vitamin B. We get tired. So that's a simple thing. And then the rest is all the stuff that happens at work. But that was a little physiological thing we did that actually works.
Brilliant. That's good to know. That's not in the book. I ought to feature something like that. But you're right, the sort of conditions we're in, and both the sort of, I suppose, physical conditions like you talked about, and then how we feel, how we're being in our work and so on, are both incredibly important in how we literally manage our energy.
I think it's also interesting, Perry, at the moment when we've got this, crazy COVID lockdown and so many people are having to work from home. And I know your book, came out before all the, lockdown stuff. But how on earth are people going to, our managers going to be able to keep their staff motivated and energized during, such a crazy situation? And I'm sure you've got thoughts and views on that.
Yeah, definitely. So you're right. I wrote it beforehand, and I can remember sending the manuscript off that was finished and all that kind of stuff. Then there was a little bit of delay, and then they sent it back for me to look over one more time before publishing. And of course, we were in lockdown by then, and I suddenly thought to myself, oh my goodness, is this book even going to be relevant now? Anyway, so I kind of looked at it slightly through my fingers. But actually, I found it was as relevant, if not maybe more relevant. And I'll tell you why. So the premise really is about the fact that we've poorly designed jobs and we don't bring enough stimulus and punctuation and variation into the way work is done. And for work, I take that to mean not just processing that you're doing per your terms and conditions, but everything about it. So your personal development, your relationships with people, those kind of things. So there's definitely something in there about the design being poor, and that we have the chance to redesign it. Now, to your point, Leslie, we can't just expect to adopt the same principles in how we work and how we connect when we're so disparate. We literally have to go, this is totally different. We cannot conduct the team meetings like we used to just simply through Zoom, because they'll be even more exhausting and you're even less likely to get a contribution into them. And we can't certainly replicate the training room that we used to spend time in learning stuff and spend 6 hours in Zoom environments with the occasional breakout and use the whiteboard facility. So this book talks about the fact that we have to take a kind of proper redesign approach. And one of the lenses to look through is people appreciating how they're energized, as in time of day, routine, stimulus, depth of work, connections with other people. And I think that's where this book probably will give people a few clues and tricks to help them with a kind of COVID situation as well. So, I didn't write it with this in mind, but I think it's equally, if not more, applicable.
What do you think the main issue is with people at work not being stimulated or not feeling part of anything or just being there?
So I think some of it is, the sort of the curse of competence, right? So we learn something and we get good at it. And if we are just repetitively going through those motions, perhaps with a different client or a different project, that doesn't really feel very stimulating, because, the whole nature of this podcast is about learning. And so there's something where if you've almost learned everything there is to learn on a job, I think at that point in time, it stops being stimulating anyway. Now, there are some people who will take a continuous improvement approach by their own volition, right, and look to make shortcuts and tinker and adapt. But there are other people who are just feeling really stuck. And so in the TEDx talk, I talked about people being in a cage, quite literally. It feels like you are a pacing polar bear. You've got no variation in routine. You've got the same thing happening to you every day. And I think that's incredibly demoralizing. Now, if your job doesn't naturally create those things, then what I'm urging in the book is that people are mindful of this and actually create punctuation, stimulation, disruption, and some challenges to that routine. Now, that doesn't just manifest itself in improvements or tackling a project on the side. That is, what else can you learn about that would enrich your experience in the work you're doing? And so there are things like that I think people can activate. But fundamentally, redesigning the job is another thing. It's like, is there something about this job that the way it's done is so understimulating that if I take it apart and put it back together again and redesign it, it'll be much more in tune with who I am. So I think there's something about that too.
Well, it's interesting. I think
there's also something about connecting with other people. When I was working, when you and I first met, I was still working for government. And I had quite a big team, and some of them worked in the office and some of them worked, from home. But one of the things that I used to say all the time to my team was, if I ever find you sending an email to somebody who's sitting next to you in the office, all hell will break loose. Or if I find that rather than just go and ask somebody a question, so you've got a problem with your IT, and rather than just pop down, or you've got a problem with something that hasn't come into reception, rather than just pop down the stairs and ask somebody, can you just give me a wee hand here? I'm Leslie from such and such and I'm having a problem. Can you help me with it? And then if you need a confirmation email afterwards on how to do something, fair enough. But I used to hit the roof when people used to just send emails to the next desk.
And I think we've seen this through email and Slack and whatever platform, right? You still get it now, and it is kind of ridiculous. I'm reminded of a kind of contact of mine. I went to do some research for the first book I wrote in 2017, and they're a tech company who adopt what they call high-speed voice technology. And it's like, what? It's like we talk to each other. It's like, oh, I see what you mean. So they like you, they sort of ban the whole electronic communication. They would rather shout across the room and or sort of talk to people. So I think you're right. I think there is something in how energizing it can be to talk to another human being and for somebody to feel noticed and then want to help you out, right? So I think there's definitely something in that. We're almost wired to want to see people solve a problem, and if I can help them do it, that's quite stimulating for us. So relationships are a big part of being energized.
Yeah.
Now, in a dispersed world, though, how do you do that? And so the team I work with, 9 of us, we're in 4 time zones. We are by nature dispersed, and so actually working this way is quite natural for us. But you, again, just have to recalibrate and redesign how you do things. Yes, we check in on Slack. Yes, we do have Zoom calls. We are making a very conscious effort to know how we feel, to know what's important to us in that day, and know that we can, share feedback openly, help each other out, learn. There's something about drawing down from somebody else that actually, if you have that kind of contract, that's quite a gift that you can cash in at any time and be expected to be cashed in by other people too. That's actually quite stimulating, and that actually creates quite a lot of energy.
Now, one thing that happens all the time in business is when you have somebody who's really good at something, who really knows their job, they're stuck because nobody wants to let them go, promote them, or do it. They want them where they're at. How do you deal with that one? Because I know people have always complained about, and I know people who've left jobs. They go to one job and they get really good at it, and then they're bored and they leave and they go to another job to do exactly the same thing. So you just kind of shake your head. But that is something that happens a lot. If you're really good at something, nobody wants to let you out of that.
Yeah, definitely, and I've seen that. And in fact, I'm reminded of an award-winning case study I saw from an insurer in the UK, where there were some people exactly like that. They were perhaps the insurance expert for maritime cases, and of course they're infrequent, but they know it so deeply, and so people almost didn't know who they were until they created a social platform where people would then put a profile. They would talk about, the most infamous case they ever worked on, the regular stuff that comes their way. So I think we can narrate our work a little bit, and that makes it more interesting for the people, and that brings you out of the sense of I'm a stuck expert into the realms of actually there's quite a lot of interesting things I've got to share with people, but I don't want to inflict it on people. I want them to draw it down for me, and so they need to know that that's what it is. And in fact, that's a really good point you've made there, Rick, because the work I've done with teams in both organization design and learning, that kind of stuff, when we're creating some content and a learning module of any sort, whether it's digital or not, we're often thinking we need the expert to help us with this. And what we've done in the Agile sort of construct is we don't graft them into the project from the start. We know exactly when we need them, when we've exhausted what we know about the subject, and then we go and commission them and say, right, expert, walk through this process. Now tell us, does this hit the mark? And now what can you stretch and get into this module that you think is going to really add value to people? And people really love that. They really love the fact that they then get to share their competence and their gift and their learning. And they feel almost like their contribution goes beyond simply processing and is about building legacy and understanding in other people. That's quite an energizing feature.
I remember when I was in the workforce originally in my 20s, and I've worked with a lot of people since then in their 20s, and one of the things that happened usually was you had the old timers who had a lot of experience, but the 20-year-olds thought they knew everything, which they didn't. How do you get that going? I've read somewhere that we have 4 or 5 generations in the workforce at once right now. How do you motivate the older ones to stay motivated, the younger ones to keep motivated and realize that they have to learn? How do you work that scenario, which is pretty prevalent?
Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to what Leslie was talking about with relationships, and it comes back to almost like, I suppose, people pairing up. And so in some ways, I quite like the idea that you have like a learning partner. There's a consulting and reward-based company in the US and UK called NextJump, and they rarely teach people things. They have a learning partner, and that learning partner is quite literally a coach when you need them to be a coach, an expert when you need them to be an expert, a connector and a signposter when you need them to be that, a curation resource, and you just have this understanding between you that you're there to learn from each other. And I think that learning partnership means it's two-way. It's the experienced person talking about the things that they'll never pick up in their, sort of junior years, and then the sort of the newer person with less years under their belt can talk about the shifts they're seeing in attitudes and technology and enrich that other person's perspective, so that they've got traditional methods then fused with new digital ways. So I think, why we don't see more of those kinds of learning partnerships, I don't know. But I think, to your point, I think it just brings people closer to the source of why they're there. One, because I've still got some value to add, and the other because I've still got loads to learn.
Right. That sounds really good, actually. Kind of a mentorship program where you go in and you've got mentor, whether it's one or more mentors, I guess. I noticed one thing, and when we've done our training, when we've taught a lot of people, when we deal with the subject matter experts, most of them enjoy being the subject matter expert, meaning they like to be called upon, whether it's younger people, older people, anybody, because it makes them feel kind of important and it makes them feel like, I'm doing something positive. That's kind of along the same lines of what you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. They're almost like the source, perhaps, of that particular practice field or something like that. So it may be that, the work they do wasn't even invented and they kind of invented it, or they grew the expertise in it. So they feel like it's theirs, and it's almost like they're the entrepreneur that's hidden within the organization. And you should never really insist they let that go, but it's nice to bring people closer to it and almost then get their own sample of the source and understand it. And I think they can also perhaps then be hosts and perhaps incubators for other people who are learning perhaps a new part of that field that they have expertise in. So if it is in something like maritime, then maybe there's a new insurance field which is about those sort of jet skis or something. And so they've been used to insuring cruise liners, but they don't know anything about jet skis. But then this young upstart comes in who knows all about jet skis, and you can almost fuse the knowledge. So I think there's definitely something energizing about people treating their part of the organization like their enterprise.
What about with so when you're doing this, because at the end of the day, we're talking about an energized workforce, and that obviously needs senior management support, because if you don't get support from senior management, this kind of thing just, if you've got people, all they want to do is tick boxes and are not interested, it doesn't happen. So have you seen anything at all that shows that having an energized workforce can actually make a difference to business results?
Yeah. So in the book there is one case study, and I call it the writing on the wall case study, because quite literally I went into a 180 strong, as in people, energy organisation. They were very innovative in the energy space, and they were an ex-governmental organisation. So the majority of the people who have been around for the longest time in that organisation and in the most senior roles were all ex-civil servants who'd been used to policy-led government funding, that kind of thing. But they were now funded through direct payments for the work they did, so they had to be commercial. And so they brought in some brand new innovative product management like commercial people, and so what was happening was there was like an energy clash going on right there. Policy led, networked, experts in the field, not commercial, and then commercial people who felt like they'd got to get permission to go and do things that were innovative from people who had no idea about what innovation was. So you had clashing energies there. So what we did was we quite literally redesigned that entire organization based on those energies. The leaders had the energy to network, connect, build relationships, and represent the lead in a practice field, whether it's green energy, whether it's, whatever. And then you had these product teams who were then no longer led by these people, but respected their practice lead and would consult them as experts when needed, who would build products, who would test them out, who would get them to market, and who would create the revenue streams. So we had to separate the clashing energies to allow the better energies to flow. Now, luckily, in that case, the CEO absolutely got what we were talking about. He knew it wasn't about incompetence per se. He knew it was about quite literally polarizing opposite magnetic forces and not complementary connecting sources when they were needed. And so 18 months down the line, I bumped into the head of OD at a conference, and I said, "Oh, how are things going?" And she said, "Look, it's gone like a dream, because everybody's now happy. It's almost like we had misfiring energy, and now it's all like AC/DC. It's completely how it should be." And so that wasn't necessarily about workflow, seniority, decisions. It's quite literally competing energies.
Interesting. Interesting.
which makes sense, because if everybody thinks exactly the same way, if everybody's energy is the same, it tends to create kind of a stasis. When you start getting a little bit of opposing energy, all of a sudden, do you remember back when, I remember when I learned brainstorming. You got in a team with people and you started brainstorming. There was always somebody who was a devil's advocate. I was usually the devil's advocate. I always got into that position. I challenged people, meaning if you have an idea and you can't back it up, support it, or have any passion for it, it's not a very good idea usually. And so we would challenge that idea, come up with something better. And, there are stupid ideas. Not everything is smart. And it created a little more hostility sometimes. But on the other hand, when all was said and done, something came out of it. Versus, it's a good idea. Me too. I agree. Oh, that's a really good idea. Okay, great. Love, peace. And then they're done. And what have we come up with? Nothing. So... yeah, it's interesting. And, I've been told, well, that's really primitive. I go, no, it isn't. It's called generating it. If you cook something, you need heat. Without heat, nothing will cook very well. And so you have to have some heat in the meetings. And I think that kind of goes to what you're talking about of energy. Energy is heat, usually. There's heat in energy. And that gets people going rather than just kind of pap and boring. And Leslie, how many times have you had employees that just agreed with you but never ever really did anything?
I didn't have that kind of team. I'm
You
very
were lucky.
Just by the way I was, as you can imagine, what I was like as a manager. And what I find quite interesting now is that on Facebook, so many of the people that were in my team or I worked with when I worked at government, and when we all split up, when we were closed down, they actually friended me on Facebook rather than me have to friend them, and we are still friends. And I'm going from people at literally at all levels, from very senior level to the people who were in charge of maintenance or on reception, and it didn't matter, because I knew if I was having somebody coming round to the office that I thought was quite an important person, I knew that I could go to reception and I could say, I've got somebody coming, and can you just make sure that you look after them? And they would say, no problem, Leslie. We'll, I said, because I think I'm going to run late and, I might not be finished my previous meeting. No problem, Leslie. We'll sort them. You don't worry about it. We'll make sure they get a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and a biscuit. And you'd be surprised. All I had to do was mention it once.
Yep.
And, that was just the way that people, and it was the same with the IT department. It got to the stage when I had problems with my computer at home, I remember taking my home computer into the IT department, and the IT department fixed it for me. Mm-hmm. I didn't have to buy a new one or send it off to anybody else. But that was about the relationship building, and rather than about hierarchy. It wasn't.
And you probably had a good IT department.
Hierarchy.
And you probably had a good IT department, because a lot won't help. That's another issue. That's an IT issue.
I worked for a technology agency, so we had the best people.
Yeah. And the Brits are famous. You have that great show. I think it's funny. The IT group.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny. I came from IT, so I spent 20-something years in IT, so I know it well. I managed IT groups, and it's like, yeah, it was interesting. Now we manage something different. Now we're doing more media-based stuff. It's a little different. People are a little bit different. The creativity's pretty much the same. It just applied differently. So.
Yeah.
So what about creativity then, Perry? How do you're chief energy officer, CEO, chief energy. How do you encourage creativity? Because to me, in order to have creativity, energy is, a huge component part of that.
It is, and I think, it's a great point. So I think what I've seen in creativity-based environments and things like, high innovative entrepreneurial cultures is that not only is the act of that in and of itself needing energy, but actually it starts to build and lift and create almost like a sustainable source anyway. People get very excited about having a sparky moment that they feel is going to solve a problem that's relevant to them or somebody nearby. And the worst thing that can happen there is that you do get people who instantly kind of just suppress it or push it back or stick it into some sort of bureaucracy. The best thing you can do is, and you can have what Rick was talking about, which is the critical friend who kind of goes, right, okay, I can feel the passion. Now convince me. I've really got to buy into this. So talk to me about how you do it. And actually, far from people getting despondent by that, I actually quite like the fact that they go from real conceptual stage to almost deployment stage by giving it a story and bringing it through. So I think you need to, I guess, create the environment where that can happen quite naturally. And that starts with a place of trust, and that starts with a place of valuing people for that kind of contribution. So I don't mean that people have to get a bonus for innovation. This is not about tickets and getting some kind of remuneration. This is about people saying, I've got an idea. I would love to see if people can help me craft it into a trial or an experiment, just to see if it's got legs and how it would work. And so, I think we've got a situation where if you allow people to do that and you genuinely trust that they're not going to do something that's destructive, damaging, counterproductive, whatever it is, most of the time people will come up with an idea that is about customer-led improvements or supply chain, strengthening or whatever it might be. I've rarely found people like really malevolent about innovation. They're normally focusing on something that's a problem for them, or a problem for a customer, or a problem for somebody else. And the innovation process like that is as sort of a learning-based environment as any kind of course you can give people. So if you say, look, okay, I'm working with a client right now where we are working out how we can give people like internal credits so that they can almost invest in somebody's idea with these internal credits. A bit like Disney dollars. When you go to Disney parks and you get dollars you can only spend in Disney, these are credits you can only spend inside the company, but you have a bank of them. And if you like somebody's idea, you say, I'm going to back you with some of my credit. And it just shows that you're invested in them. And then they'll get some momentum, they'll get a business case, and they'll show how those credits are going to be used. It just builds a nice sense of accountability and, like I say, that entrepreneurial spirit. But all the time you're saying to people, it's safe. There's a crash mat. This is a learning space. You're not going to damage anything. Go forth, try it out, learn about you, learn about projects, learn about other people. And I think all of that stuff is incredibly energy giving part of the workplace that often gets stifled by a suggestion scheme or some other monstrosity. So stuff like that, making it naturally happen, being very entrepreneurial, very open, transparent and inclusive, it's a winner.
So in essence, let them make mistakes, but keep them safe within their mistakes.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't believe in the Facebook, go fast and break thing. I don't believe in that. I think this is about giving people the sense that this is quite literally, like I say, when you put on the sumo wrestler suits, it's a bit like that. You're going to bounce off things. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about transformation? Your other job, part of your job title is transformation. And I find that quite interesting as well, because some organizations do get stuck in a rut and they do need to transform. How do you go about, starting something like that or implementing something like that?
A great question, and it's a really topical thing, isn't it? I guess not just with the COVID-19 response, but just digital and everything else. So I look at transformation as having two potential impacts on people. It will give them dread that the transformation is going to mean some form of irrelevance for their work or loss or whatever, because they'll see perhaps this being a trendy relabel for a restructure when it shouldn't be that. It should be much more fundamentally about something never being the same again with real good reason and so on. So they may have a draining reaction if they fear that it's going to negatively impact on them. But at the same time, there is then a very positive charge to come from it if you are including people in that transformation. If you are saying, we need people who are going to step into a space and help us transform the way we recruit, the way we train our grads, the way we have learning development for leaders, those kind of things. And if that's the invitation, then I think transformation has a positive energy spur for people, because they're like, I'm getting my hands on something. I'm going to help influence, shape and dictate where this can go and solve the problems I believe really need to be done. So what I've advised and what I try and get people to do is to stop picking people for transformation projects based on their job title, and quite literally just invite all comers. If you've got the energy to want to transform something, then that's your entitlement. And in fact, again, I've got clients who've done that, and they deliberately say, right, leave your badge at the door when you come join transformation project, because what we want is not you, the job holder. We want you, the passionate employee who wants to show us how we can learn to collaborate and solve the problems we need to solve. Now, that is a really smart recipe, I think, for getting people into a very energized state about something that's normally quite troublesome for people. And in fact, if you know your peers are on a project, not necessarily just the normal chosen few, you tend to think a little bit like, well, they're not likely to do anything damaging for me because they're one of me. Do you know what I mean? They associate a safer way that somebody is conducting themselves in that environment. And so I think that's how I sort of start the discussion around transformation, which is obviously know where you want to get to and know what people are buying into, but invite people to participate, even if they don't feel like they've got the competence. It's almost like it doesn't matter, because we want those fresh perspectives and challenger views. You'll learn your way into the things that you'll need during this, and we'll help you out. And then plug in the subject matter experts when you need, all those things we talked about before. And I found people are incredibly responsive to that, incredibly responsible about that, and create some of the more imaginative things I've ever seen, and are really good at selling them to leaders too. So there's definitely something about when you really feel it's your product. I suppose it's the IKEA effect, isn't it? You love it so much, you sell it so well.
Yep, that's great. And
that's somebody who's energized.
Yep, and I think with that point we have run out of time, and that was great. That was a good ending subject too.
I know. We've been on for 30 minutes, Perry.
A little over, and it went fast. But we'd love to have you back on and talk some more about this.
Thank you for having me, and brilliant questions, and really enjoyed the sparring. So thanks very much.
Well, great. Well, thank you. And if you're watching the show, we'll have information on Perry below, so you can get a hold of him. Or what was the name of the book, Harold? Energized Workplace book. Is that available on Kindle?
Workplace.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. So you can get it on Kindle. You can get a hardcover or a softcover. I'm not sure what it is, but it sounds like a great book. And we'll see you next week. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks again, and take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.